Okay, Yins, this video is going to be a little different. As you can tell from the title, we're going to be talking about kitchen knives and audio cables. And you might be wondering from that title, what do they have in common? Well, the truth is, not much. But before you accuse me of clickbait, I do want to point out that they do have something in common, and that is they're both essential and yet kind of boring. You really can't make a meal without knives, and you really can't do pro audio without cables. And a lot of people will go through both without really understanding which ones they need, how to use them, or even the differences between the types. Today I'm going to go back and forth between discussing types of audio cables, essential cooking knives that you should use in the kitchen. I realize there might not be a huge crossover between the two audiences, but you never know. If you're here to learn about kitchen knives, specifically which are the best starting knives to start out with in your kitchen, or if you're interested in what is an XLR versus a TRS, balanced and unbalanced, then hopefully you can also learn something about the other one. So, hey, kitchen goers, hey, audiophiles, let's get together and cut up some cables? Cables can be confusing and a jumbled mess. I swear I spend so much of my life coiling and uncoiling cables, but they are a necessary part of the audio industry, specifically and especially in a recording studio. We just don't have reliable, quiet, well-functioning wireless systems. Everything's got to be plugged in. So I'm here to clear up some of the terminology and words and acronyms that you see thrown out there. I'm not going to do too much of a deep dive. Point out that we're only going to go over analog cables, no digital cables. I'm not even going to touch on things that technically are an analog cable, like a BNC, but they're used for digital purposes. That'll be a topic for some other time. First up, we have the XLR cable, probably the most common cable you'll use in a recording studio. It's often referred to as a mic cable because most often you use it for hooking up a microphone and plugging it into a preamp or whatever you're going to be using it for. It is a 3-pin and 3-strand cable. Most people mistakenly think that the XLR stands for ground, left, and right, but that is not true. The naming convention actually comes from its inventor, James Cannon, of Cannon Electronics, who are most known for making cameras. The name actually refers to the different innovations that he created in making the final form you see today. This was the Series X, which included the casing that we see today. The L is for the latch, when you had a latching mechanism, so they would stick together and not come apart accidentally when tripped on or pulled. And R is for rubber, the rubber that was added in between the pins on the female end so they would not bend. So there you have XLR. Now, speaking about female and male end, it always confuses me, but as I said, the rubber end is the female end, and the end with the exposed pins, if you will, is the male end. Now, the XLR is a balanced cable. That's why there's 3 pins. One to carry the positive, one to carry the negative. That's just how wire and transmission works. And the other one is a ground wire. What that does is it eliminates any hum or extraneous noise at the beginning and the end, cancels it out. So it's more of a quiet signal. Professional cables tend to always be balanced. First up, we have the chef knife, arguably the single most important knife in the kitchen. This should definitely be your starting knife and may actually be the only knife you need. I recommend getting one on the larger side, that way it has more versatility as a slicer. This here is an 8-inch. Being that this is going to be your most used knife, you may want to spend a little more on this one than the other ones. I went a little overboard here and bought a Damascus steel Bob Kramer edition shun knife. Every time I pull it out of the block, it's like looking at a piece of art. It makes me smile, and if prep work isn't making you happy, then you're not doing it right. It is your workhorse tool. It can cut,
slice, stab, and most importantly, chop. It is great for doing the rock chop method, especially when doing it two-handed to mince things like herbs.
Next up, we have a TRS cable. This is essentially the same cable and the same wiring as the XLR, just has a different plug at the end. So the TRS stands for tip, ring, and sleeve. There's three distinct connections, just like there's three pins on the XLR cable. Again, it's a balanced shielded cable. Now, this cable comes in different sizes. This size here is usually referred to as a 1/4 inch cable. Outside of the US, it may be referred to 6.35 millimeters. It also comes in 1/8 inch. This is the size you more commonly see associated with headphones, especially earbuds. Technically, it's not 1/8 of an inch, it's 3.5 millimeters. But again, in the US, we just round up to our wonderful fun numbers. Although you don't see this too often, there is actually a mini jack. It is 2.5 millimeters. Usually I see this on some obscure headsets, usually for phones, sometimes for gaming consoles. I think this one was actually for the Xbox 360. Now, the 1/4 inch TRS is most commonly used in the studio, just like an XLR. Sometimes items just have different endings. So instead of having something that fits a XLR cable input, it'll have a 1/4 inch plug on it. Essentially, they work and function the same thing. Now, when you get to the 1/8 inch TRS, they actually usually serve a different function, like your earbuds. Instead of being a positive, negative, and a shielded ground, they're actually carrying a stereo signal. So when they function as a stereo, they are not shielded. Usually, this isn't a problem with like consumer electronics. Your earbuds don't usually need to be shielded.
Knife number 2 should be a paring knife. This is the complete opposite end of the size spectrum from a nice big old chef knife. In many ways, it's the same, but smaller. This makes it great for things that are just too small of projects for a chef knife, like cutting up small things like garlic cloves.
All right, next we have a TS cable. You see, it is very similar to the TRS, except it only has the tip and the sleeve. So this is a unbalanced cable. Typically, you see these for instruments, specifically guitars, where the shielding isn't really needed. You might be asking, well, can you use a TRS on an instrument like a guitar? And the answer is sometimes. It really depends on the manufacturer and how they design the input jack. I find that some of my guitars will work fine with a TRS, it just ignores the rings section, and others it will not produce a sound at all. But for the most part, you want to stick to the correct type of cable just to make sure everything's working like it's supposed to. You never want to use a TS in place of a TRS because you will get that ground hum.
Okay, knife number 3 will actually depend on what you cook. If you do a lot of meats, then a slicer is going to be the next one you're going to want to go with. Slicers are long and not very wide. They are great for slicing large pieces of meat like a turkey or a roast. For these guys, I usually say go big, larger than your chef knife. This here is a 10-inch Japanese style slicer called a yanagiba. It's only sharpened on one edge, making it razor sharp for slicing through things. The downside is you can't use most normal sharpeners, you have to use a sharpening stone, but let's not really get into that today.
Okay, everybody following me so far? Good, because I'm probably about to confuse you. This is a speaker cable. And if you look at it, you might think, oh, isn't that just a TS? And you are right. The termination plug is exactly the same. Really, the only difference with a speaker cable is its gauge, the thickness of the wire. And just looking at the actual wire isn't a way to tell. The rubber could be of any thickness. It's the gauge of the wire inside, which you can't see, that really matters. Now, the reason you need a thicker gauge for speakers is because sometimes they can carry a huge amount of wattage. Think about on stage, live concert. You got thousands of watts running through one of these wires. And with a high wattage, it can actually carry a charge. So if you are using a thin gauge TRS cable, not a specifically made for speaker cable, it could melt. Another type of speaker cable, again, thicker gauge, but different terminations, is a Speakon. It uses a proprietary end. They're latching, kind of like the XLR are, and they make quite a secure connection. The great thing about the Speakon is you know they're speaker cables. This is not just a regular TS cable. This is made for speakers. Unfortunately, not all speakers and related amps and cabs have these kind of connections. So they're great when they do work. The other downside is they are proprietary, so it adds to the cost. You're paying extra amount of money for these as opposed to just a regular TS speaker cable.
Okay, knife number 4 or number 3, if you don't need a slicer, is going to be some sort of a mid-sized knife between your larger chef and your paring knife. I recommend a Santoku. It's another Japanese style knife and traditionally has a flat edge, but more often than not you find westernized versions that are sharpened on both sides and have a curve at the end, so you can still do a little bit of a rock chop. This just gives you a little more versatility in your collection. I like to use it a lot for things like green peppers. Mine is a 5.5-inch ceramic blade. Again, razor sharp, maintains that edge for longer than a metal blade, but you cannot sharpen it on your own. Luckily, this Kyocera here has a lifetime sharpening. I just send it back to the factory and they send it back to me with a new edge.
Okay, gonna throw another confusing one at you. If you take a look at this guy, this looks like a TRS. It is balanced cable, but as you can see, it is much smaller than a regular TRS, but not quite the mini 1/8 inch. It is a proprietary design, much like the Speakon cable. These are called TT Bantam, and the TT, believe it or not, stands for tiny telephone. These actually come from the patch bays that were used back in the old AT&T telegram and telegraph when you would have a switchboard operator. You know, the old pictures of someone with a headphone going click, 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 click. It's a holdover from the days of those telephones. Now, we still use them in patch bays today in modern recording studios. The upside for them being so small is you can fit more of the connections in a smaller area, so it saves space. You see, we have a 192-point patch bay, only using up 3 units on our rack. Downside, again, proprietary, so these tiny cables like this can run you anywhere from $20 to $60.
Okay, feeling a little left out because you're a vegetarian and you don't need that slicer? Or maybe you just do a lot of stir fry, and man, do I have the knife for you. The Nakiri. This is a great vegetable chopper. It slices, it dices, it chops. Another Japanese style knife. One thing to note, although it does look a little bit like a butcher knife, it is very delicate and almost brittle. It's for slicing and dicing, not for chopping through bones or other hard objects. You actually can chip the edge. I love this blade for cutting carrots and other such vegetables into perfect stir-fry sizes. Plus, the wide blade is really great for scooping things up. Just be careful not to ruin your edge when doing so.
All right, now time for more of a miscellaneous category. These ones are RCA. You usually don't see these too often in a professional studio. They are not balanced. Usually they're for stereo, left and right. You will see them on old turntables, old CD players, some consumer electronics. Again, not balanced. You might see it in a studio situation, so it's good to have a pair on hand.
Next, let's talk about serration. Generally, you don't want a serrated blade. Cheaper knives often have these because, well, they're cheaper, and at first it looks like they cut better. But the serration can wear down, and there is no way to sharpen it. And actually, A well-sharpened straight edge will be way sharper and actually easier to use than the best of a serrated knife. There is an exception here, and as Professor Fantomas will tell you, serration does belong on a bread knife. Trying to cut through crusty bread with a normal blade usually just smushes it. So in this case, you want to have those teeth.
I didn't really want to get much into adapters. It's usually just a way from converting one plug into another plug, but this is such a common one. I really wanted to talk about it. It's usually called a Y cable, sometimes an insert cable. What it is, you have a TRS goes in this end and it separates it into two TSs. Essentially, usually what it does is it splits that stereo TRS into a left and right. You will see them on some guitar amplifiers that don't have a separate send and return. They just have one plug for an insert. So you would use something like this to separate your send from your return on your effects pedal.
Okay, I'd say that does it for all the main knives you need. Anything else is going to be extra, but hey, extra is fun. Boning knife is used to, well, cut around the bone of a meat. It's especially handy on things like a ham bone, where the unique size and shape of the blade really lets you get in there and cut around things. And speaking of blades that are just for fun, that is a butcher knife for me. Sometimes it's fun to just slam this guy right down into something. And honestly, I think I maybe just bought it because it looks cool hanging on a nail on my wall. If you do a lot of, butchering, it's probably going to be more useful to you, but that's just not something I quite do much.
All right, last one. DB25. It looks like and actually is the same as a parallel printer port, for those of you who can remember such a thing. It is 8 individual balanced connections in one tiny-ish end. You can use it to directly make 8 connections between one DB25 and another, or more commonly, they're used as breakout cables. So you'll have 8 individual XLRs or TRS on one side and the DB25 in the other. This allows you to have a smaller footprint on the back of a gear, but still be able to attach 8 large XLR balanced cables to it. It's a space-saving device. These are, like a lot of other audio cables, pricey, but all in all, it's cheaper than buying 8 individual XLRs.
Okay, last the oddball knives here is the Deba. This Japanese-style knife is used for deboning and filleting fish, especially in a very specific manner, of which I have never used it for. I got this one honestly so I could practice sharpening one-sided Japanese-style knives. But it does act like a small chef knife, so I like to use it on things like cutting up garlic cloves or even deboning chicken thighs. Just another neat little tool to have in your arsenal, especially if, your chef knife is dirty and you just need another clean blade. Okay, gang, I hope everyone learned at least one thing today. That was my goal. So now that everyone is an expert in both cutlery and audio cables, get out there, make some food, make some music, make some fun. See you next time.